Hi, Sam here from the Be Bold History Network. Hopefully you've already watched the first in this series of videos with Dr James Boyce about Colonial Australia. In this second video, we'll talk in more depth about what happens in Australia after the initial period of British colonisation. Please do tweet about this video if you found it useful. You can use the hashtag BeBoldHistory, or you can tweet us at BeBoldHistory. It would also be really helpful if you could subscribe to the YouTube channel that you're watching this video on right now. Subscribing's really simple. Just hit the button that says subscribe in the top right hand corner. So we've spoken a lot about what kind of is driving actors, historical actors who are driving the settlement of Australia. What about kind of abject or widespread ideas or ethos, I suppose? I guess really what I'm talking about is there a civilizing mission in Australia, or is it purely commercial?
Yeah, again, an area that's been much debated and discussed. You see, Australia is an Enlightenment project in a sense. 1790s, and French revolutionary ideas are around, and there's quite a few the Scottish Enlightenment people, influences, and then into the 19th century, the whole movements for political reform, Chartism and ideas of democracy are all influential here. What's going on in America has its impact. So there's a sort of, in a way, it is a transplanted British culture, and it's not as, one of the things that people have been realising is how connected. There's been a lot of research on these imperial networks. Australia is isolated, yes, but it's also people are corresponding and we're talking about an elite here, sure, but there's an extensive networks across the empire that have been a focus of a lot of research over the last couple of decades that show how much ideas are sort of crossing and meshing and finding expression. That is true of New South Wales. It's both isolated and yet it's part of the environment. Of course, it's not that far from India and the Pacific, and it's not cut off from the world. And the movements, the gold rush. We haven't talked about the gold rush in Australian history, but if people are looking at a broader 19th century Australian history, the gold rush is very, a central facet of that, because the population just explodes. So we go from a fairly low settler population, really, to being a significant colony after that. So Melbourne goes in the second half of the 19th century is one of the fastest growing cities in the British Empire. The gold rushes particularly transforms Victoria, but also to a lesser extent New South Wales. If just to take as an example, as a Tasmanian, like Van Diemen's as we were talking about before, was one of the most, the first part of the 19th century. In 1830, 1/3 of the European population on the Australian continent lives in Tasmania, but we're now less, about 1% of the population. So we're a significant site in this early period. And even at the time of the gold rushes, when the gold rushes begin, the sort of early 1850s. So in 1850, we have a similar population to the Port Phillip district, been colonised for the grasslands, as we talked about before. And so Port Phillip district is the old name for Victoria, so we're a similar size to Victoria. 10 years later, as a result of the gold rushes, Victoria has a population that Tasmania still hasn't reached. We've been growing like a little bit ever since, But it's just an explosion of immigration, and so it transforms that process comes with it is that happens at the same time as the self-government of the colonies. So up until the early 1850s, mid-1850s, the Australian colonies are crown colonies, like governed direct. So there are sort of legislative councils set up, and there's some, there's some restriction on the full power of the governors. The first governors are sort of have total power, really. But so ideas of when the colonies become self-governing and they have constitutions, effectively they run themselves. So the Australian states, what we now know as the states, they're all separate colonies. So Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, South Australia and Western Australia. Western Australia is a late developer. It doesn't become self-governing until the end of the 19th century, when it has its own gold rush in the 1890s, and its population increases to a level where it's given self-government. But the second half of the 19th century, all the other states are basically running themselves. Britain is involved with only at a secondary level in relation to, it's still trade policy and defence, and they still see themselves, though, very much as British. Part of the British Empire. The politics becomes democratic politics, and some of the colonies become really world leaders in progressive democratic reform, in terms of women having the right to vote. South Australia is granting that in the 1890s. When Australia's federated in 1901, so the colonies formed the Federation of Australia, still within what's understood as the British Empire. This is not seen as independence in the way that America was. They see them. This is an Australian Commonwealth within the empire. But there's quite a bit of progressive at that time. I mean, sadly, very different from the present. Australia is at the forefront of social reform measures and age pension. So we have the emergence of trade unions as well, and labour politics. So there's some similarities with what's happening in Britain, but there is the pace of social reform here. It's certainly at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. It's faster. What the dark side of all this, of federation, which again is another big theme of Australian history, is other than the continued neglect of Aboriginal people, in fact, increasingly racist legislation, protectionist legislation, but really in most of the states institute legislation is increasingly race-based, but also immigration controls, this notion that this continent was to be for white people. So this has taken much further. The British Empire, within Britain itself, of course, carries on an idea that people are British subjects within the empire. So a big force for federation in Australia is to ensure its essential whiteness and stop the threat of Asian immigration. A lot of Chinese people had come in during the gold rushes, and the different colonies that had enacted different sort of restrictive frameworks to keep them out. But the real priority of the new Federation of Australia was to enact this on a national scale. And so we have the highly restrictive immigration, which is, people of British people are white British people are welcome here, and in fact encouraged and subsidised to come here, and others are kept out by various measures. So this is the next big transformation really in Australia is after the Second World War, when the white Australian policy starts to break down. Because even the bringing in of people from, the first big step of that is refugees after the Second World War from other European countries. Even that would have been very controversial before the war. It's to have Italians and Greeks. Melbourne is, I think, the second biggest Greek city in the world now. And the transformation of Australia through immigration since the war has been really quite extraordinary in the lifetime of people still alive. And it probably is the great post-war achievement, how that was done without a lot of political, with a sort of bipartisanship. And given the politics of race, how fiercely they were ingrained in national politics, it was an achievement. In the 70s and 80s, the early 70s, the White Australia policy was ended altogether, and we've had large immigration from across the world since that time, not just from other European nations, to create the sort of multicultural melting pot that modern Australia is. And sadly, really only in the last 15, 20 years, certain conservative politicians, as you might have heard, one of them, sadly, I think, has just been given some sort of post, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott with the British government. These people actually stirred up the immigration debate in a way that hadn't happened in Australia since the Second World War. Started exploiting it, really targeted at refugees and boat people, and stirring up hatred in the community that there's been a lot of resistance to, but we are now caught up in some of the same sorts of debates that you've had, and really, as I understand, it's a very sad reality that some of the most hate-filled campaigners in Europe look to Australia as an example, because basically we used the Navy to stop boat people coming here and enacted all sorts of harsh legislation. We still have a refugee immigration program, but you're not allowed to, asylum seekers who come by boat, funnily enough, not by air so much, but by boat, are treated with awful cruelty. And some of them have been in offshore detention, for years, because they're not allowed to come to Australia. So it's the immigration question is another big theme of Australian history in the 20th century. And the White Australia policy and the end of the White Australia policy, the post-war transformation of the country for immigration, and the Indigenous story in recent decades, we probably won't have a lot of time for, but the courts finally recognised an absolute landmark decision called the Mabo case. The High Court recognised the native title rights of Aboriginal people. So that's been of enormous, not just legal significance, but I think, symbolic, or whatever the right word is, our understanding of who we are as a people. That this sort of formal legal recognition that Aboriginal people were here, they had legal rights to that land. They were possessors of the soil, and they were, they had their own political units and their rich cultural life. This sounds like it should have been basic. How did we never not see this? But to have the High Court finally name that up in legal terms was a moment of great healing, I think. A long way to go, but we're getting there. It is important to remember how recent all this history is. I think that's another facet that people can consider. Most Australians have only been living here. Really, it's a matter of a few generations. So it's a tiny, in the terms of the continental timescale, in terms of the human history of this continent, we're talking about just this sort of recent few seconds at the end of this, at the end of the day. If human history is on a 24-hour clock, we've just come here in the last couple of minutes. It's the grandeur of the story, I think, is the wonder of it, the majesty of the human history of this continent. And people who haven't been to Australia, people who have been to Australia will know not just the vastness of the distance, but what the uniqueness of the natural world here. This is the marsupial stronghold. This is the place where, and it's not true that when the British came, they were not filled with wonder either. You know, there's a myth that's still so current in Australia that irritates me to the death, because there's so little historical evidence for it, that the British come and all they see is strangeness and hostility and barrenness, and they have no relationship or connection. They can't see beauty here. All they can see is how, you know, ugly and strange and upside down it all was. And it's only us modern Australians that have started to appreciate the land. I mean, this is just historical nonsense. And of course, there's different reactions to the continent, and the continent's very diverse, and how people react to certain landscapes is different from others. But people are fully, you know, not all people, you know, but it's a widespread appreciation of the wonder and difference of this place. But more to the point, I would say, more to the point, is people are changed by the experience of living here. You know, we are not this, and this is true of all settlers across the empire. We need to get out of our idea that all power is with the invaders, that we're immutable, that, you know, we have all the forces of technology, we're the ones with the guns, we're the ones with the scientific knowledge. We come to these new lands, and we just impose our will on the land. We're never changed by it ourselves. We remake the land in our own image. We decide what will happen to the Indigenous people. We decide their history. There's no agency on their part. And this is a bit how history has been written, including by sympathetic historians of the left, often, you know, who are lamenting it. All power is given to the conqueror. All power is with the imperialist. We need to step back from this arrogance. And realise not only did agency continue to reside with Indigenous people, but we were also changed by our encounter with them and with the land. Obviously, it depends on class and how much money you've got. If you've got a lot of money behind you and a lot of capital, you can impose your will in a way that you can't if you're a poor ex-convict who's having to learn to survive and farm and adapt. You know, so it's always dependent on context. Power is real, interests are real. But let's not see this as a one-way change process. You know, let's recognize and once history is looked at like that. So my first book, Van Diemen's Land, was very much about that, about how this there's no place is shaped by the convicts more than Van Diemen's Land, because we never have a big free settler land rush. So the majority of the population, right through the 19th century, are convicts and their children. And these are mostly poor people, and they are profoundly changed by their encounter with this land, which is not a hostile environment. In fact, it's not some sort of Gothic island prison, as it's sometimes portrayed. In fact, the environment is the main source of freedom, some independence from magistrates and masters. So my book, Van Diemen's Land, really is about the paradox of how this convict population found a level of freedom in this land. And so this encounter with the continent of British civilization, of British people, is an extraordinary story. And it's one that's still unfolding, and it's a very young and early story, and one that we're still, as a culture, really only at the beginning of understanding. And I think because of the convict aspect of it, I've always welcomed the fact that we haven't had the burden like they have in the States. I mean, the terrible burden of this creation story, you know, the Mayflower story, if you like, the Pilgrim Fathers, the 400th anniversary of which we're commemorating this year, their departure from Plymouth. That if you look at how that story's influenced America's belief that they're sort of the chosen people and there's a chosen land, and the burden of this creation story and the suffering, you know, for other people, associated with it. Australians, in a way, are fortunate that we've got this convict foundational story that's meant Australians are a sort of, I mean, the disadvantage is there's been a certain disengagement with even our own history, let alone Aboriginal history. But the advantage is that we don't have a sense that we're, you know, the saviours of the we've sort of been blessed by God in the same way the Americans had.
I wonder whether we finish this section on kind of Australian history on a question that we had on Twitter, or a series of questions really, from a history teacher in the UK, Ben Lovett. I think you've touched on this a lot, really, and I think that last piece really is a real call to arms for British history teachers. But he asked kind of, why should we teach about Australia in UK schools? And he suggested that often in schools in the UK, Australia and New Zealand, Ireland, perhaps, and other colonies, but especially Australia, gets sidelined perhaps in favour of British India. What would you say to history teachers who might be doing that about why they should maybe think again and ensure that they're including Australia in their curriculums as well?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Obviously British India, in terms of sort of certain themes, is far more important in terms of the geographical expansion of empire through the 19th century. I mean, it's securing the trade routes to India. India's sort of at the heart of the imperial project in commercial terms. But the empire is not only about trade. So that in terms of the actual experience, in terms of connecting the imperial story to the lives of ordinary British people in the 19th century, so not just the sort of merchants and trade. I mean, obviously British India is connected with this as well. Don't get me wrong in terms of the integration of the economy. I mean, there's overlaps all over. But in terms of the actual emigration experience, as this new exhibition at the Migration Museum that's opening today document, that the Migration Museum in London want people to engage with the story of emigration, because that helps us engage with the story of migration. We're immigrants and migrants. And the story of what's happening to ordinary people in both the countryside and cities of England during this extraordinary transformation of Britain during the 19th century by agricultural revolution, industrial revolution, but also enclosure and changes in land ownership and changes in customs and cultures, and the emergence of a working class, and all these great themes and essential themes to understanding where we are now. They can be integrated. I mean, I would be suggesting, rather than seeing Australia as a sort of separate subject, if you like, that both the transportation story, this convict transportation story, and then the immigration of British people to this continent, and what happens as a result of that here, be integrated and be seen in the context of what's happening in Britain at the time. There's a way of, you can actually make the story human, if you like, in a way, through that. So the people, those early exiles, why are they being exiled? Why is this surplus prisoner population? What is going on? What sort of society is deciding to colonise a continent right over the other side of the world with prisoners? I mean, that's a question that seems pretty pertinent. Why do so many questions open up from that? Why is this the surplus prisoner population in the first place? Why would you possibly be imagining that the best way of solving this problem might be, dumping them over the other side of the world? But then you go through, I mean, something close to my heart is the enclosure movement and the dispossession of rural people. I mean, while a lot of the convicts, perhaps even majority, I mean, there's some debate around this, are from rapidly growing urban areas of England, the new city, industrial towns, the Manchesters, the Birminghams, the parts of London, the Glasgow, etc. They are not. You don't have to go back very far to see you with most of them, to see the story of enclosure and dispossession and where they'd been made homeless in their own land. So this sort of story of how these people become then the dispossessors, the dispossessed become the dispossessors, and some of the big themes of the forces that are transforming Britain are the same forces that are transforming Australia. So I would be suggesting that while with British India you're dealing with, I certainly wouldn't be wanting it to displace British India. What I'd be suggesting would be that the story of Australia could be looked at to illustrate some of to what's going on in Britain and how, amongst the ordinary people, how they're living, some of their sort of hardships, how their lives are being transformed. Yeah.
I think there's an awful lot of joined up thinking to be done there, isn't there? And just as you were talking, myself and my colleague John at my school this year have taught a new unit on empire, trying to integrate empire and the story of kind of move from mercantilism to direct control, the story of the industrial revolution, and intrinsic within that being also the sugar trade and therefore enforced migration there. We've tried to weave that in with the story of an civil unrest post-Napoleonic Wars. And actually, yes, we haven't done this aspect of Australia. And actually, I think we need to next year. That makes so much sense. And just going to add, would add so much to that story.
I think the convict transportation in itself is so interesting. And there were political prisoners as well. It's an opportunity to look at some of the lives of those individuals. Ireland, of course, there's a lot of Irish convicts come. And some quite famous political prisoners come, but most people are, victims of poverty, really. And while we did have in Australia a long debate about, because traditionally it was understood you could be sent out for just stealing a loaf of bread, and that's still probably what the average Australian believes. They didn't do very much. And then the historians did all the empirical work and went through all it, and they said, oh no, actually they did do a lot, offences were more serious than just stealing a loaf of bread. But in fact, there's a wisdom in that sort of cultural tradition that they just stole a loaf of bread. And the wisdom is it was about poverty and need, and these crimes, of course, they're not murderers. You were hung if you did crimes like that. They're mainly crimes against property, mainly about theft. And it's not a story of despair. It's because I always say with Tasmania that we should be talking about, we're planning to build we only got 500,000 people here even now, and we're planning to build a second big prison. I say, well, surely this island, of all the places in the world, we should know the dangers of institutionalising people. We are the experiment. This was a grand social experiment as to what would happen when because they used to believe in a criminal class, so that there was a belief that people were sort of innately criminal, and that they were reproducing. There's this great fear of the mob. And this criminal class had to be controlled and disciplined because they sort of were innate. There was nothing much you could do about them. It was the fear, and they would just breed more criminals. So this is the great experiment of whether this is true, and this is a debate that's still had. How much is it environmental factors, is crime, and how much do you need sort of punishment systems? Fear of consequences, and people are sort of. How much is it rested in social circumstance? Now, Tasmania is the ultimate proof that criminality, crime is largely a result of the environment. Because here we became the most law-abiding colony in the British Empire in a generation by by the 1860s, there's almost no crime here. And now it wasn't like the system gave people an awfully big break. Don't get me wrong. We're not talking about a sort of 1860s version of Scandinavia. I mean, the system was still brutal and harsh and was locking resources up in a small elite and was really sort of had all sorts of punitive legislation aimed at social control. But people had access to the essentials of life, some capacity for independence and dignity, and crime stopped. Not completely stopped, but largely stopped, become much lower than it was back in England itself. Now, this is a grand, fascinating and enormously relevant social experiment in terms of looking at the crime. Now, what was happening in those newly industrial cities and why there was crime, and also in the countryside. Remember, there was a lot of unrest pre-1850. The unrest is not just in the English cities, it's also in this supposedly tranquil, idyllic countryside. The agricultural labourers and those ordinary villagers are not like they were at the end of the 19th century or early 20th century. They're not passive. They're in revolt as well. The unrest is really widespread, and there's not the consistent. All those themes about what was happening at the time are tied. You can tie in with transportation, but it doesn't. What I meant with the comment about the end, it doesn't have to be It's not just a gloomy story. I think we've got a. What's very important to me in talking about history is that we never imply or even sort of assume or somehow convey to our audience, whether the students or our readers, that all of this is just governed by forces that are bigger than human beings. That the people are not acting within this space, that choices are not being made. And obviously we have to face the realities of power, self-interest, vested interests. All of that needs to be named up. But in doing that, we mustn't just cede all power to the powerful, if you like. And so there is all power to these impersonal forces, market or to profit or greed, as if they will inevitably triumph over anything else. Because Australian history shows that, the convict history shows that, Aboriginal history shows that. It shows this contest going on. It shows people struggling, resisting in all sorts of ways, creating home in all sorts of surprising ways, adapting, changing. It shows the richness of history and how the present was not predetermined, or what was happening. People didn't know what would happen with this social experiment, and in many ways they were surprised, at what happened. If we can show that in our history and in the past, I believe it means that young people in particular, won't carry this same sense of loneliness that we have to start all over again to have any hope of saving the planet, as if the past is all just the problem. So everything that happened in the empire, it was all terrible, all of it. And everything how we lived on the land before was all terrible. We never lived on the land with any respect. Everything about sort of the British Empire was this. And in Australia's case, everything about the early British settlers, they thought the land was just foreign. They just had to transform it. They had no understanding of it. Not only is it lonely, to be cut off from your ancestors like that, an ancestral content, but not only is it ahistorical, it's actually goes against what we know from research, that the story is so much more complex and nuanced and diverse and human than that. But it's also despairing of the future, because if these big forces, these big market or economic forces, or however we understand these big forces that operated in human history, inevitably triumphed in the, were inevitably overwhelming human agency in the past, then there's no, sense of hope for the future. There's a fatalism that can set in. And so I think how we tell the story of the past, and I don't mean to break the discipline of the, I don't mean to impose our politics on it or to try and use it for some agenda. I don't mean that at all. I mean actually to stay within the finest empirical traditions of the discipline. But to tell the story in a way that human beings aren't written out of the story, and human beings are wondrous. They're also, there's plenty of brutality and suffering and hardship that needs to be faced and faced honestly and looked at. But let's not turn the people of the empire into just sort of actors on a stage where they're in a drama that's been written by some force that's not human. Politics is happening, choices are being made, humans are responding.
Thanks for watching this video from the Be Bold History Network. If you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can also get in touch with us on Twitter @BeBoldHistory, and if you are talking about us, use the hashtag BeBoldHistory.